computer. There we go. Welcome again, folks, to Political Economics at the University of Pretoria. If you are a little bit lost, we are in 2021, believe it or not. So today we're going to see a couple of papers on, let me share my screen, a couple of papers on the slave trade and colonialism. The first paper that let me just move a little bit here. The first paper that we are going to see today is the paper by Nathan Nunn, The Long-Term Effects of Africa's Slave Trades. As we always do, folks, the title is already, it gives you the research question, which is essentially the long-term effects. So it gives you the idea already that he's going to use some historical data to predict contemporaneous contemporaneous development, right? Because he's talking about long-term effects. The abstract, which very first sentence in the abstract, folks, he already gives us the research question. Can part of Africa's current underdevelopment be explained by its slave trades? Right, that is the research question. Very first sentence of his abstract, and he already gives us the research question. So no blah, 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 first sentence, research question, okay? Which is essentially, folks, again, he will use historical data because there are no slave trades anymore. So slave trades is something of the past, right? And he will try to use that data on the slave trades or on the number of slaves exported, right, on African underdevelopment. Okay. How is that he does that? The data, he uses data from shipping records and historical documents reporting slave ethnicities to construct estimates of the number of slaves exported from each country during Africa's slave trades. So, folks, slavery is always a tough subject. The Holocaust is a tough subject. There are subjects which are very tough, but we economists, we have more and more to say about these subjects, and apartheid is a tough subject. And I hope some of these papers give you ideas in order to tackle the long-run effects of apartheid on South African underdevelopment. So the slaves, they were essentially, they were people, yeah, I don't think we need to highlight that, right? But they were essential to those people at the time, they were considered commodities. And obviously that there were records, right? They were commodities, those people were essentially commodities, and there were records. Traders, they take note of everything. So Nathan Nunn uses shipping records and historical documents reporting ethnicities. Why is it important to know the ethnicity of the slave? Because then you can locate where this slave is coming from, right? There was very little slavery in South Africa, but if the ethnicity of a slave was Xhosa, then you would be that slave would count as a slave coming from South Africa, and so on and so forth. So it's important for him to use the ethnicity of the slave being exported in order to locate where this slave or slaves are coming from, okay? What does he find? So essentially, folks, as I said, there are three things in an abstract, right? What is that this person is doing? So the research question, and then information about the data, it is already there. And now the findings, the results. And he finds a robust negative relationship between the number of slaves exported from a country. So now he's not talking about ethnicities anymore. He's talking about number of slaves exported from a country, because he can match the ethnicity of a slave to a particular country using the modern boundaries of Africa. Okay. So he finds a robust negative relationship between number of slaves in the past exported and current economic performance. So what he is essentially saying here, folks, is that those countries which exported more slaves, they do less well nowadays in terms of GDP per capita. That's what the proxy for development that he uses. Okay. And then at some point, he's going to tell us the channels, the mechanisms, because in the abstract, let me see, he examines the method and the IV as well. He examines the historical evidence on selection in the slave trades and use IVs, instrumental variables. And then finally, modern results, the evidence suggests that the slave trades had an adverse effect, a negative effect on current economic development in Africa. He doesn't say anything at this stage in the abstract about the channels. What is the intuition? But he's going to say that as we move along, right? Very clean abstract with all the information. Very clean title, which gives you already the research question, and very clean abstract, which gives you everything that you need to know of a paper: the research question, the data, the method, and the results. Everything is there. Okay. Let's go straight to the introduction. First sentence of the introduction, he starts by motivating the paper or motivating the subject. Africa's economic performance in the second half of the 20th century has been poor, right? One often informal. So he's saying that's an informal research question, and he's going to formalize this research question now. Explanation for Africa's underdevelopment is its history of extraction, characterized by two events: the slave trades and colonialism. And he's going to talk about the slave trades, right? What else I found interesting? Not much on slave trades, possible contribution. However, the other important event in Africa's history, its slave trades, has yet to be examined empirically. So essentially, he's saying that up to that point in time, it's 2008, right? Yeah. It was published in 2008. That means that it was probably written in 2005, 2006, right? Up to that point, not a long time ago, up to that point in time, there was very little in terms of economic literature covering the effect of the slave trades on African development. Okay, so essentially he is telling us that what is his contribution, what is that he is adding to this literature. Okay. Innovation of the paper. Well, essentially, folks, it's a sort of an interesting question, right? Even WITS students keep telling us this and that about the role of colonialism, blah blah blah. But they don't have the empirical evidence, right? So that's what this paper does. This paper provides the first empirical examination of the importance of Africa's slave trades in shaping contemporaneous economic development. What was the importance of those countries? Because as I said, he's going to have number of slaves exported with the ethnicity of those slaves, right? And then he's going to match those people with the modern boundaries of African countries. And then he's going to construct a measure of number of slaves exported from Nigeria, or number of slaves exported from Angola, number of slaves exported from Mozambique, and so on and so forth. All right, that's what he's going to do. And then he's going to use that variable, that historical variable, because the slave trades, there are no slave trades anymore, right? So he's going to use that historical variable. He's going to regress that historical variable against contemporaneous GDP. I think he regresses on GDP in the year of 2000. Okay, we are going to see in a few moments. Modern data, he constructs measures of the number of, okay, now I'm just repeating myself, measures of the number of slaves exported from each country in Africa in each century between 1400 and 1900, right? And the estimates are constructed by combining data from ship records on the number of slaves shipped from each African port or region with data from a variety of historical documents that report the ethnic identities of slaves that were shipped from Africa, so that he can match the ethnicity with the modern boundaries of African countries. Okay. What does he find? That's the information about the data. So the first sentence there is the research, the innovation, and then data. And the data is very much, it was a gigantic effort at the time in order to put this data set together. What does he find? He finds a robust negative relationship between the number of slaves exported from each country, right, and subsequent economic performance. The African countries that are the poorest today are the ones from which the most slaves were taken. That's essentially, he finds strong correlations, and then he uses instrumental variables to get some causality. But up to this point, folks, okay, okay, that makes sense. The countries which exported the highest number of people, they don't do very well nowadays. But what is the actual channel, right? That's an important thing. An alternative explanation that is just, oh, okay, now he talks about a little bit about possible threats to validity, right, of his identification strategy. And he obviously the usual threat to validity for any identification strategy is possible endogeneity for all sorts of reasons. And then he talks there, that's what he talks about there. An alternative explanation that is just as plausible is that countries that were initially the most economically and socially underdeveloped, they selected into the slave trade. So poor areas, right, they ended up selecting themselves into the slave trades, right? So poor countries or poor ethnicities ended up being the ones getting or sending more people into slavery. And these countries continue to be the most underdeveloped today. If that is the case, then there is a potential threat to validity of his identification strategy, right? So he is essentially raising a potential endogeneity problem that he is going to deal with later on in the paper. Okay. Motivation and possible channel or the mechanism. So now it gets more into economics. Both sources of evidence show that it was actually the most developed areas of Africa that tended to select into the slave trade. So actually what he's saying is that no, it was not the poorest countries which selected into the slave trades. No, actually it was quite the opposite. It was essentially those countries which were doing better, economically speaking, which ended up selecting themselves into the slave trades, right? With its own consequences for future development. Instrumental variables endogeneity results are robust. He uses instruments to estimate the causal effect of the slave trades on subsequent economic development. So that's essentially the research question again, and then he's telling us that he doesn't only use OLS, but he's going to use also instrumental variables, and he comes up with an idea for an instrument. And what is this idea? The instruments are the sailing distances, right, from each country to the nearest location of demand for slave labor in each of the 4 slave trades. Right. So essentially there was, for instance, the most, because it's also a bit ideological, right, folks? We live in South Africa, but there were 4 slave trades. And usually we associate slavery with the European slave trade, but there were other 3 slave trades. The Europeans, they didn't invent slavery, right? Slavery was already happening in Africa before they started sailing to these shores. But let's use the European example, right? Europeans were the traders, right? But there was a lot of demand for slaves coming from the new colonies in the American continent, especially the south of the United States, right? The deep south, the deep American South, and the northeast of Brazil, and also from what we call the West Indies, right? It was essentially, there was a lot of demand for the slaves to work in those sugar and tobacco plantations of the American continent. Okay, so he's going to use the distance, right? So obviously that most slaves which were exported to the American continent, they left, given the distance, right? They left, and he's going to show us the map in a few moments, they left from Ghanaian ports, right? Because of the proximity of the Golden Coast with the American continent. Channels slavery correlates with state collapse. He examines whether the procurement of slaves through internal warfare, raiding and kidnapping resulted in subsequent state collapse and ethnic fractionalization. And he finds that the data are consistent with this channel. So essentially, he's telling us, he's giving us the channels. Oh, okay, some countries exported more slaves, more people into slavery, and now they are not very developed nowadays. Okay, that's a robust correlation. Yeah, that makes sense. But after that, we need a mechanism, right? We are economists. We are not statisticians. We need to give a credible mechanism to make sure that we understand. That's what analysis is, right? You run your regressions and then you give your regressions a doable, credible story based on economic theory, right? And things that he mentions there, that areas which exported more slaves, and it was the procurement of slaves was via internal warfare, raiding and kidnapping of people. It resulted, folks, obviously it resulted in state collapse, because once you start enslaving your own population, that's very difficult to have any sort of credible state. And also it resulted in more ethnic fractionalization, because usually one ethnicity within the same state would enslave a different ethnicity, right? There are other channels that he's going to talk about in a few moments, but those can be. And obviously that this leads also to, as I said, to the idea for that paper which came out in 2011, which is about social trust, right? Areas or countries which exported more slaves, they also have lower social trust nowadays. And if people do not trust each other, people do not transact with each other, right? People do not invest in each other. Another channel that when I was rereading this paper last night, that is plausible here, folks, is that, okay, some countries are exporting more slaves than others. And we know, right, folks, that this is essentially, we are talking about people. We are not talking about cows or oxes. We are talking about people, which were treated like commodities. But we are also talking about potential or prospective human capital, right? We know that from Solo and Romer, that those societies are lost to slavery. Historical background, a bit of African history, folks. I recall, usually I don't cover historical background because once I was teaching these papers on African development in my previous institution, which is located in Braamfontein, Johannesburg. And the students said to me that they didn't need me to tell them about their own history. So usually I skip this part of historical background, but you can see, folks, that all these papers talking about African development, they always have a section on historical background. It's always important to give the reader the historical background. Okay, so I will assume that Pretoria students are different, and I will say a few words about the historical background. But essentially, folks, I'm not telling you about your own history. I'm just regurgitating what Nathan Nunn tells us about African history. So essentially, historical background, between 1400 and 1900, the African continent experienced 4 simultaneous slave trades, right? The largest and most well-known is the transatlantic slave trade, right? Which is essentially what we associate with the European slave trade to the American continent, where I'll have to ask guys to mute their microphones, otherwise there is a bit of static, right? It's Mancani, so I'm gonna mute you again. Okay, there we go. So the largest and most well-known is the transatlantic slave trade, where beginning in the 15th century, slaves were shipped from West Africa, right, from what is now Ghana, West Central Africa and Eastern Africa to the European colonies in the New World, right, which is essentially the American continent. And then there is a little bit on the other three slave trades, the Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean slave trades were much older and predated the transatlantic slave trade, right? And there is a little bit of information there. During the Trans-Saharan slave trade, slaves were taken from south of the Saharan desert to Northern Africa. In the Red Sea slave trade, slaves were taken from inland of the Red Sea and shipped to the Middle East and India. And in the Indian Ocean slave trade, slaves were taken from Eastern Africa, right, the other side, and shipped either to the Middle East and India or to plantation islands in the Indian Ocean, right? So just a little bit of information there for you folks. History, a little bit more on history. The total volume of slaves traded was unprecedented in history, right? Slavery has existed in human societies for quite some time, but the volumes of those 40 slave trades between 1500 and 1900 was unprecedented, the numbers. During the transatlantic slave trade alone, approximately 12 million people were exported from Africa to the American continent, right? Africa's slave trade history and China's Africa's slave trades were also unique because unlike previous slave trades, individuals of the same or similar ethnicities enslaved one another, right? And this had particularly detrimental consequences, including social and ethnic fragmentation, right? So because one ethnicity enslaving another will probably generate ethnic fragmentation. Political instability, because also it was going to be very difficult, right, to have a credible, trustable state with different ethnicities under the same umbrella. And obviously, weakening of states and the corruption of judicial institutions. So it had an effect. Let me see here. Silly question. When would you use 6 versus 6, 6 versus 6, like another 6 million exporting the other 3 slave trades? 6 versus... Can I tackle that later on? Okay, I'll leave it here. And the slave trades, fractionalization, and state collapse. A little bit more on the channel, right? The most common manner in which slaves were taken was through villages or states raiding one another, where groups of villages had previously developed into larger scale village federations. Relations between the villages tended to turn hostile. As a result, ties between villages were weakened, which would affect trade, right? Which in turn impeded the formation of larger communities or larger states and broader ethnic identities, right? As I said, folks, different ethnicities, it's not something that exists only in Africa. Right? Ethnic fragmentation or fractionalization is not something that exists only in Africa, right? All human societies have been divided like that at some point in history. If you go to Germany, a Bavarian looks kind of different. Bavarian looks more like me. Looks very different than someone from Saxonia, and so on and so forth. Those are different. In the past, different tribes, but nowadays we have a state covering it. We have an umbrella there, right, with different ethnicities, and people do not identify themselves. It's not salient anymore. But in Africa, it is very salient, right? I don't need to tell you, right? As I said, as someone said to me, you don't need me to tell you your history, but every 2 years we have xenophobic attacks in South Africa, and it's easy because it's still very salient. Okay? It's easy to identify targets because it's very salient, right? And then Kuzimba writes that insecurity confined people within ethnic boundaries, constructing spheres of interaction, so very small boundaries. And because of this process, the slave trades may be an important factor explaining Africa's high level of ethnic fractionalization today. Okay. Or why this is still so salient in the African continent and not that salient anymore in Europe, for instance, or in Southeast Asia, right? Let's see what else he says that might be interesting for our story here. History, state fragmentation and collapse. The most dramatic example may be the Congo Kingdom of West Central Africa. We kind of saw a paper last week about the Congo Kingdom, and we're going to see another one next week, right? Which was a large, essentially, it was a kingdom, right? As early as 1514, the kidnapping of local Congo citizens for sale to the Portuguese had become rampant. It's quite early, right? 1514. The Portuguese had just arrived in Brazil in 1500. Okay, but they were also trading people. For sale to the Portuguese had become rampant, threatening social order and the king's authority. In 1526, Afonso, king of Congo, wrote to Portugal complaining that there are many traders in our corners of the country. They bring ruin to the country. Every day people are enslaved and kidnapped, even nobles, even members of the king's own family, right? So they would communicate sort of information to each other. This breakdown of law and order was partly responsible for the weakening and the eventual fall of the once powerful state of the Congo, of the Cuba, in fact, of the Cuba Kingdom. For many of the other Bantu-speaking ethnicities, stable states also existed in earlier periods. We saw 2 weeks ago the pre-colonial institutions. Also existed in early periods, but by the time the slave trades were brought to an end, few ancient states remained. So it was what he's saying here is that when slavery was abolished, the slave trade, not slavery, right? When the British abolished the slave trade in the 19th century, there was very little left in terms of societies in Africa, in those areas which are selected into slavery. Modern channels, because Africa's slave trades were an important factor affecting political underdevelopment, they may be a central reason behind Africa's weak states today. Okay. And here is an important part of the paper, because here is where he explains the data, and the data is one of the innovations of this paper, not the method. He uses OLS and instrumental variables. Maybe the idea for the IV is clever, but the main innovation essentially is the data, right? So he spent some time explaining the data because he's interested in examining the effects of the slave trades that resulted because of the procurement of slaves. His measure of interest is the total number of slaves taken from each country during the 4 slave trades between 1400 and 1900. More on data. The first are data that report the total number of slaves exported from each port or region in Africa. And he refers to these as shipping data. As I said, those people, they were treated as commodities, like in any sort of slave trade. And therefore, traders themselves, they take note of everything. They take note of what they have in terms of goods, right? For the transatlantic slave trade, the data from the updated version of the transatlantic slave trade database constructed by those people there. The database records the information for almost 35,000 voyages from 1514 to 1866, right? The shipping data are originally from various documents and records located around the world, because in most European ports, merchants were required to register their ships and declare the volume and value of goods transported for each ship and voyage, essentially because they had to pay taxes, right, folks? Typically, there exists a number of different registers and documents. In the database, 77% of the transatlantic slave voyages after 1700 have shipping information from more than one source. The average number of sources for each voyage is 6. It's estimated that the database contains 82% of all transatlantic slaving voyages ever attempted. All right. So he's essentially in the last sentence, he's saying that his data is pretty representative, right? It's estimated that the database contains 82% of all transatlantic slaving voyages, right? So he's saying that his data is quite representative. It's almost the whole population of voyages, okay? And slaves shipped from the ports of a coastal country may have come from a country located further inland, of course, right? To estimate the number of slaves shipped from the coast, then that's why it's important, the information on ethnicity now, right? To estimate the number of slaves shipped from the coast that came from inland countries, he also uses a second source of data that reports the ethnic identity of slaves shipped from Africa, right? So that he can match, as I said, he can match the ethnicity of someone coming from inland with the contemporaneous boundary of African countries. He also uses a second source of data that reports the ethnic identity. Okay, I'm just repeating myself. This information comes from a variety of sources, such as records of sale, slave registers, slave runaway notices, court records, church records, and notarial documents. It's quite a rich data set, which, by the way, is available for you to use. There were a number of sources of slaves. It describes the data in detail. It's one of the innovations of the paper. There were a number of ways of identifying. Yeah, that's the question. But how do you identify the ethnicity, right? The ethnicity or nation of a slave. The easiest was often by a slave's name. Slaves are often given a Christian first name and a surname that identify their ethnicity, as well as slaves' ethnicity could often be determined from ethnic markings, such as cuts, scars, hairstyles, or the filling of teeth. Right? Oldendorp writes that the people of all Negro nations, I apologize for the use of the word, but it's someone writing in 1777, right? Are marked with certain cuts on the skin. As far as I have been able to learn from the Negroes themselves, these serve to distinguish one nation from another. Okay, so I apologize for the use of the word, but the word is in the paper, and because he's citing someone who wrote in the 18th century. Okay. Table 1 summarizes information about the samples used in the transatlantic slave trade. The table reports the location, the years covered, the number of slaves, and the number of ethnicities that could be identified for each sample. Similar tables for the other 3 slaves are reported in NUN 2007, which is the working paper version of this paper. Table 1 is there, folks. Essentially, that is table 1. I didn't highlight table 1 with any yellow because it's kind of, you just look, right? And you see where those records are coming from. Yeah, okay. And that is the map. I think it's an artificial map of the. This is the map, right, of that we saw last week, I think. And we're going to see again today in the second paper, not only in this paper, but in the second paper. Those are the ethnic boundaries, and then also the modern boundaries of African nations, right? Overall, the estimates are consistent with the general view among African historians of where the primary slaving areas were. During the transatlantic slave trade, slaves were taken in greatest numbers from the slave coast, which is essentially Benin and Nigeria, right, up there. Also because, folks, remember, those places, they are closer to the American continent, which, remember the idea of of where the demand for slaves was coming from. West Central Africa, Zaire, Congo, and Angola. Angolans were essentially sent to Brazil and the Gold Coast, Ghana. All of these countries appear among the top exporting countries on the list. Ethiopia and Sudan on the other side. Okay, I muted Anel. Sorry about that. All of the Ethiopia and Sudan on the other side of the continent are also among the top exporting countries on the top exporting countries because, but to different slave trades, not to the Atlantic slave trades, because they were the primary suppliers of slave ships during the Red Sea and Saharan slave trades. The low number of slave exports from South Africa and Namibia confirms the view of African historians that these areas exported virtually no slaves. Careful here, huh? He is not saying that there was no slavery in Africa and Namibia. He's just saying that those countries didn't export slaves, okay, as much as other countries, right? So always be careful with the politics. Let me stop here to see if there are questions. Questions, comments, suggestions? Because now we are going to see the identification strategy and then the results. All clear? Okay. Let me share my screen again. Base correlations, which is essentially OLS estimates. OLS estimates are usually treated as correlations. He begins by examining the relationship between past slave exports against current economic performance. So he's, as I said, he's going to regress his variable for the number of slaves exported from different countries against GDP per capita in 2000 in different African countries. Table 1, or table 2, in fact, that's the data, summary of the data, right? With a number of names of countries, the World Bank ISO code, and the country name. You can see that Angola is the place that exported the higher number of slaves, essentially to the transatlantic slave trade, and mostly to the northeast of Brazil. There are other countries there. South Africa is down there, right? But just to give you an idea of the countries in this sample. And then, folks, there is basic correlations. What is that we have there? Exports, right? We see countries, export countries against GDP per capita in 2000. So I was actually right. And we see the negative correlation between number of slaves. Those countries here are the countries exporting the highest number of slaves, and the correlation is negative. Okay. And then identification strategy, he further examines this relationship by controlling for other country characteristics. So he puts some control variables there that are also potentially important for current income. Baseline estimating equation is there, which is essentially why is the GDP per capita in country I, right, in the year of 2000. And then we have exports, number of slaves being exported. Okay, OLS regressions, table 3, simple table with information, OLS estimates, right? What really matters for us here, what the paper is about, is results export, number of slaves being exported against 2000 GDP, and we can see the negative correlations there. right? And significant, and they are all different from 0, okay? Okay, that is easy, right, folks? Now you have to tell us what is the mechanism, okay? When you write about a paper, if you are referring this paper, you have also to tell us what is the mechanism behind those estimates. And he discussed that, and he's going to discuss that again to reinforce, and then we can talk about those things also on the top. And then endogeneity, causality, and measurement error. Remember, the main source of potential endogeneity there is that poor countries selected themselves into slavery, right? If that is the case, then there is obviously an endogeneity problem there. So alternative explanation for the relationship is that societies that were initially underdeveloped selected into the slave trade. So because they needed the money, right? They needed to develop themselves, and they started selling their own people, right? And these societies continue to be underdeveloped today. So there is a path dependency there. Therefore, they observed a negative relationship between slave exports and current income, even though the slave trades didn't have any effect on subsequent economic development. So, but that's not going to be the case, okay? First, using historic data and qualitative evidence from African historians, he evaluates the importance and characteristics of selection into the slave trades. As he will show, the evidence suggests that selection was important, but it was usually the societies that were the most prosperous, not the most underdeveloped, that selected into the slave trades, right? Second, IV, the distance. He used the distance from each country to the location of the demand for the slaves. So there was demand for the slaves coming from the West Indies, from the deep American South, and from the northeast of Brazil, essentially, okay? For those plantations. He used the distance from each country to the location of the demand, right, for slaves as instruments for slave exports. The IV results confirm the OLS estimates. That's usually the case, right? Trade before slavery, selection, large proportion of the early trade between Africans and Europeans was in commodities other than slaves. During that time, only societies with institutions, right? For you to trade, you need some institutions. Only societies with institutions that were sufficiently developed or were able to facilitate trade with the Europeans. Between 1472 and 1483, the Portuguese sailed south, right, before they went to the American continent and arrived in Brazil. The Portuguese sailed south along the west coast of West Central Africa, testing various points of entry, looking for trading partners. But they were not interested in slaves, folks. They were interested in goods. They were unable to find any societies north of the Zaire River that could support trade, right? Vanzina writes that the local coastal societies were just too small in terms of people and territory. So if their societies are too small, they have no incentive to abandon hunting and gathering. Their economic and social institutions were too undifferentiated to facilitate foreign trade. So it was difficult to have foreign trade. Sustained trade didn't occur until the Portuguese found the Congo Kingdom, located just south of the Zaire River. Because the Congo Kingdom had a centralized government, a national currency, and a well-developed well-developed markets and trading networks, it was able to support trade with Europeans. Where was I? Okay. When European demand turned almost exclusively to slaves, the preference to trade with the most developed parts of Africa continued because the more prosperous areas, he's explaining also why is that the most prosperous areas selected into slavery, were also the most densely populated because it was a matter of numbers, right? Large numbers of slaves could be efficiently and easily obtained if civil wars or conflicts could be instigated. Right. It's interesting, folks, because the second paper is very much about the ethnic boundaries and the modern boundaries and conflict. Okay. So these papers, they all follow from each other. As well, societies that were the most violent and hostile, and that was going to be hard work, right? And therefore, the least developed were often best able to resist European efforts to purchase slaves. For example, the slave trade in Gabon was limited because of the defiance and violence of its inhabitants towards the Portuguese. This resistance continued for centuries, and as a result, the Portuguese were forced to concentrate their efforts along the coast further south. There is a picture here, population density. So he's making a strong statement, right? What does he do? If you are making a strong statement, you back up your statement with data, and that's what he does. Okay, so he shows us the data that log population density for 1400 correlate positively with slave exports. Okay. IV's second strategy that he pursues is to use instruments that are correlated with slave exports. So remember, the characteristics of a good instrumental variable is that the instrumental variable is an extra variable that you are going to come up with. And this variable is correlated to your main independent variable that you believe to be endogenous, although it's supposed to be exogenous. So you are going to provide this variable. The instrumental variable is going to provide this endogenous independent variable with some external power. It's going to help this variable to be exogenous again. Right, instruments that are correlated with slave exports, but uncorrelated with other country characteristics. Okay? Then those are the characteristics of a good IV. IV validity. As instruments for slave exports, he used the distance from each African country to the locations where the slaves were demanded. The validity of the IVs rely on the presumption that although the location of demand influenced the location of supply, right, the location of supply didn't have any influence on the location of demand, right? So sugar plantations, tobacco and sugar plantations were implemented in the American continent, not because they were closer to the supply of slaves coming from Africa, but because of the geography of the American continent. Okay, so sugar plantations were established in the West Indies because the West Indies were close to the western coast of Africa, which is not the case, then the instruments are not valid. However, if instead many slaves were taken from Western Africa because it was relatively close to the plantation economies in the West Indies, then the instruments are potentially valid. Okay, so again, one is influencing the other, but the other is not influencing the previous one. Okay, always make sure that you have those things in mind. In the West Indies and locations in southern US, slaves were imported because of climates suitable for growing highly valued globally traded commodities such as sugar and tobacco. I have just said that. The existence of gold and silver mines was a determinant of the demand for slaves in Brazil. And also sugar, right? The first economic cycle in Brazil was sugar in the Northeast. Okay. In the Northern Sahara, Arabia, and Persia, slaves were needed to work in salt mines, and in the Red Sea, slaves were used as pearl divers. Sailing distance locations from the point on the coast that is closest to the country's centroid to the closest major market of the Atlantic slave trade. He used the 9 largest importers of slaves, which are Virginia, Havana, Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, Dominica, Martinique, Guyana, and Salvador and Rio in Brazil. You probably know where Rio is. You probably don't know where Salvador is. Salvador is in the very northeast of the country where the sugar plantations were implemented. And there it is, right, folks? The map, right? That's Salvador, that's Rio, and which just gives you an idea of the location, right? Let's see the table 4, estimates of the relationship between slave exports and income. And what he finds there, folks, is that we are going to stop for a break in a few moments. So that's the second stage, right? The dependent variable is log income, just as before, in 2000, against number of slaves being exported. And we see that now those are estimates, right? Those are telling us that there is some causality between those two variables that are always negative and statistically significant. And you can also see that the size of the estimate or the size of the effect is larger than in the OLS regressions, because now the IV is providing exports with this extra explanatory power. And then possible channels. Let me stop here to see if there are questions, comments, suggestions, grievances. All cool, all clear? 1, 2, 3. Okay, let me go back to possible channels of causality, possible explanations, right? Possible economic explanations. That is a channel. Exports against ethnic fractionalization, those countries which exported, right, the highest number of slaves, they happen to be also the most fractionalized ones. Okay, and that is that's an interesting thing. It's current ethnic fractionalization. Okay. Question. Let me stop sharing here. Question: how do we actually get data on ethnic fractionalization? It's a question to you folks. What is ethnic fractionalization? Come on, guys. I've been talking about ethnic fractionalization here for 3 weeks now, and you are going to indicate that you have no idea of what ethnic fractionalization is. If you don't have any idea, just tell me. Manuel, I have no bloody idea. The foggiest idea.
Prof.
Go ahead.
So it's when there are multiple ethnicities that are split between countries now, or originally and now are in one country. Am I on the right path?
You are on the right path, but I need more than that.
Okay.
But you are on the right path. Any other shot? So no, Michelle. So let's assume, folks, that there are 7 students over there, right? There are 8 participants, but 1 is me. So there are 7 students there. And let's assume, I apologize, but it's just a teaching example. Let's assume that all students in front of me are from South Africa, right? Let's assume. As I said, I apologize. Just an example so that I can give you the concept of ethnic fractionalization. So assuming that all of you are South Africans, were born and bred in South Africa. Okay. So and then if I start running a survey, okay, and I ask Aneri and Adinda, right? Now, I don't want to know, but if I was running a survey, right, and I would ask Aneri and Adinda, folks, what is your home language? Right, and you would answer the survey, and you are going to say, we're going to say, my home language is blah blah blah. I don't want to know, right? But my home language is English. Okay, assuming. Okay, and then I would ask Jarnavi, right? What is your home language? Right, and then she would tell me, my home language is blah blah blah. Okay. And then I would ask Deron, what is your home language? Okay, and then I'll start tabulating this information, right? My survey answers provided by you. You are essentially giving me your home language, right? So do you think that all of you or most of you will have the same home language? Because I was born in Brazil. And most Brazilians speak the same home language. We always speak Portuguese, right? Because if you don't speak Portuguese in Mediterranean countries, you are essentially out of the system. You can be a Polish immigrant, you can be an Ashkenazi Jew, you can be a Syrian, a Lebanese, a Japanese, Chinese. In Brazil, you find all those people. Right, you can be a former slave from Angola, right? But all Brazilians speak Portuguese, because if you don't speak Portuguese, you are out of the system. Okay, but coming back to South Africa, coming back to this sample of 7 people, 7 students, do you think that the answers to this survey will tell me that most of you are home language, right? I understand that all of you speak English, right? But that your home language, it's essential. Ethnic fractionalization is the probability that you guys speak different languages at home, right? And that's how people put this sort of data together. It's the probability that in Tanzania, a bunch of people, right, they will speak different languages at home, although English is the lingua franca, right? Or in Nigeria, that is the probability that a bunch of people will speak different languages at home. Okay, that is ethnic fractionalization. It's based on your language, on the language that you speak at home. Okay, does it make sense, folks?
Does this include religion and our culture? Because you can see in South Africa, we have different cultures.
No, they don't. It doesn't include religion, right? It includes the language that you speak at home. It doesn't include whether you are Catholic or a Protestant or a Jew or a Muslim or a Buddhist, or whether you follow your traditional beliefs. No, it is very much the way they put this sort of data set together is based on the language that you speak at home. Okay.
Prof,
Go ahead.
does this include dialect?
It's so much of money.
Yeah, it includes dialects, right? Probably it includes dialects, but I'm not sure. I will have to check.
Give me your old phone. Let's see. Give me your old phone. Maybe you sent it from. Give me your old phone.
But if it's sent from.
Okay, I muted Jahnavi. So I don't know if it includes dialects or not. I am not sure. I will check. That's a good question. Okay, but that is the idea, right? Is the probability that a bunch of people in Germany, right, or in Great Britain, or in Tanzania. I'm using the Tanzanian example because it's one of the most ethnically fractionalized countries in the African continent. But South Africa is also pretty fractionalized. Okay. Although nothing compared to Tanzania or Nigeria, where really hundreds of different languages are spoken. Okay, in South Africa, that's not the case. Okay, let me quickly, because okay, that's why we had this conversation, because of ethnic fractionalization, right, folks? And you see that the most ethnically fractionalized countries are, you see Nigeria there, you see Ivory Coast, you see Gabon, and so on and so forth. And another channel, slavery and state development. Another channel, number of slaves exported on the horizontal axis against 19th century state development. And you can see that the correlation is negative. So in places or in countries, right, because he is talking about countries, in countries which exported the highest number of slaves, they also have low state capacity or state development. Okay. What else in here? Economic development since 1950. You can see is low slave export countries, which is the darker line, against high slave export countries, which is the gray line. And you see that countries which exported less slaves, they have higher GDP per capita. Okay. And conclusions. Combining data from shipping records and data from historical documents. He is just repeating what he has said in the abstract and in the introduction. He's constructed estimates of the number of slaves exported from each country in Africa during Africa's 4 slave trades. Okay, and he finds a robust negative relationship between the number of slaves taken from a country and its subsequent economic development. So again, he's using a historical variable, which is number of people exported during the 40 slave trades against contemporaneous development. Okay. And I think that's pretty much it, folks. And then he's got the appendix. Just to show you the appendix, you can see a lot of textbook material. If you have text, prelims are always textbook material. If you have a lot of textbook material, and then extra information about the data, right? Because the data is an innovation of the paper. He puts a lot of extra information, the summary stats, all those things, they belong in the appendices, right? There's some robustness in there. You saw that he doesn't provide us with a lot of tables and robustness tests. It's just a couple of tables with results, right? It's a very nice paper. And